The photograph was burning in Muhammad Ali's hand, and he watched the edges curl black as flames consumed the faces of two boys standing side by side in boxing gloves, both smiling at a camera that had captured a moment before everything broke. It was March 1975, and Ali stood alone in his Los Angeles backyard at 3 in the morning, feeding memories to a fire he'd built in a metal drum, watching smoke carry pieces of his past into a sky that didn't care about regret or loss or the particular way friendship dies when ambition gets involved. The boy on the left in the photograph was him, Cassius Clay at 16, thin and fast and certain that the world would bend to his will if he just hit hard enough. The boy on the right was Marcus Webb, his best friend, his first real sparring partner, the person who'd believed in Ali's greatness before anyone else saw it coming. How do you burn the evidence of someone who used to be your brother? The photograph turned to ash and drifted up with the smoke, and Ali added another one to the fire, this time both of them older, maybe 19. Holding a trophy they'd won as a team in some long-ago tournament that didn't matter anymore except as proof that they'd once been inseparable. Marcus had been more than a friend, he'd been the other half of Ali's ambition, the person who'd pushed him in the gym when pushing himself wasn't enough, who'd celebrated victories and absorbed defeats and promised they'd both make it out of Louisville together, both become champions, both prove that black kids from the West End could be more than what the world expected. But only one of them had made it out. Only one of them had become champion. And the gap between their trajectories had opened like a wound that never healed, had festered into something toxic that had finally exploded 6 months ago in a way that made reconciliation impossible and forgiveness feel like betrayal of self-preservation. What happens when the person who knew you best becomes the person who hurts you most? Ali fed another photo to the flames. This one from his Olympic victory in Rome. Marcus in the crowd behind him, visible if you knew where to look, grinning like Ali's gold medal was his too. Because back then they still believed success was communal, that one person's rise would lift everyone connected to them. But success hadn't worked that way. Success had been selfish and isolating, had required Ali to leave people behind, to outgrow relationships that couldn't adapt to his expanding universe. Marcus had stayed in Louisville, had kept boxing but never made it past regional circuits, had watched his best friend become Cassius Clay, then Muhammad Ali, then the greatest, while Marcus remained Marcus Webb, 31 years old, teaching boxing to kids at the same gym where he and Ali had learned together, living in the same neighborhood, dating the same kind of girls, stuck in a life that looked exactly like what 16-year-old them had been desperate to escape. And somewhere in that stuckness, Marcus had started to hate. Not openly at first, not with the clarity of acknowledged resentment, but in the small ways that accumulate into something poisonous. The comments about Ali getting lucky, about his style being more showmanship than skill, about how different things would have been if Marcus had gotten the same breaks, the same opportunities, the same white managers who saw profit in promoting a loud black kid who could actually back up his talk. The fire was getting bigger now. Fed by photographs and letters and newspaper clippings, Ali had saved for 15 years physical evidence of a friendship that had meant everything before it meant nothing. His hands were smeared with ash and his eyes were burning from smoke, and he knew this was dramatic, and knew that burning memories at 3 a.m. in a backyard fire was the kind of theatrical gesture people would mock if they knew about it. But he needed the ritual, needed the physical act of destruction to match the emotional one. Why does betrayal from friends cut deeper than betrayal from enemies? 6 months ago, Marcus had given an interview to a boxing magazine. One of those, Where Are They Now? Pieces about fighters who'd trained with champions but never became champions themselves. The journalist had clearly been looking for the inspiring angle. Loyal friends still supporting his famous buddy, proud of Ali's accomplishments, living vicariously through success he'd helped build. But Marcus had given them something different. He'd talked about how Ali had stolen his style, had watched Marcus's footwork and speed combinations and incorporated them without credit, had built a career on techniques Marcus had innovated in sparring sessions that nobody else witnessed. He talked about promises Ali made to bring Marcus up with him, to make sure his friend got title shots and big purses once Ali had the power to make those things happen, promises that evaporated the moment Ali didn't need Marcus anymore. He'd talked about how Ali had slept with Marcus's girlfriend back in 1960, had denied it for years, had let Marcus look like a paranoid fool for accusing his best friend of that particular betrayal. And Marcus had receipts, letters he'd saved, people willing to corroborate, evidence that the story Ali had maintained for 15 years had been a lie designed to protect his image at Marcus's expense. The interview had been devastating, not because it ruined Ali's reputation. His reputation had survived much worse, but because it was mostly true. Not all of it, and not exactly as Marcus framed it, but true enough that Ali couldn't dismiss it as jealous fiction. Couldn't write it off as the rantings of someone bitter about their own failures. He had borrowed Marcus's techniques without acknowledgement. He had made promises he'd failed to keep, though more from neglect than malice, from getting caught up in his own ascension and forgetting the people he'd promised to pull up behind him. And yes, he'd slept with Marcus's girlfriend, had justified it at the time with the logic of 19-year-old testosterone and opportunity, had lied about it because admitting it would have destroyed the friendship, and Ali had wanted both, the girl and the friend, without having to choose. Could you burn away guilt by burning its evidence, or did the guilt live somewhere fire couldn't reach? Ali added more photos to the flames, watching faces he barely recognized now, young and hopeful and ignorant of how complicated everything would become. There was one of them after Ali's first professional fight, Marcus in the corner, even though he wasn't officially part of the team. There because Ali had insisted, had told Angelo Dundee that Marcus was good luck, that they'd started this journey together and needed to continue it together. But Dundee had eventually pushed Marcus out, had explained to Ali that professional boxing wasn't about loyalty to childhood friends, was about building the most efficient team possible. And Marcus's skills as a cornerman didn't justify keeping him around when his presence created complications. And Ali had agreed because that made sense, because professionalism required hard choices, because keeping Marcus around out of sentiment was the kind of weakness that cost championships. When had he become the kind of person who chose championships over people? The answer was obvious. He'd always been that person. Had always known on some level that greatness required sacrifices most people weren't willing to make, that you couldn't have deep, meaningful relationships with everyone and also have the singular focus necessary to become the best in the world at something. But knowing it and confronting it were different, and standing in his backyard burning photographs forced confrontation in a way that normal life allowed him to avoid. Marcus's interview had included a detail that haunted Ali more than the accusations of theft or broken promises or sexual betrayal. Marcus had said that the worst part wasn't the specific wrongs Ali had committed, but the realization that their entire friendship had been transactional from Ali's perspective. That Marcus had never been a person to Ali, just a useful tool that got discarded when it stopped being useful. He looked at me like family, Marcus had told the interviewer, and I looked at him like a resource. That's the difference between people who make it and people who don't. People who make it can't afford to see other people as fully human. They have to reduce everyone to what they can extract, what value they provide. Cassius, sorry Muhammad, he mastered that early. I never could. That's why he's champion and I'm teaching kids to keep their hands up. Was that true? Had Ali really been that calculating, that cold? He wanted to say no, wanted to believe that his friendship with Marcus had been genuine, that the love had been real even if the outcomes had been unequal. But feeding photographs to fire at 3 a.m. suggested he knew the truth was more complicated, that maybe Marcus was right. Maybe Ali had been performing friendship while actually conducting a cost-benefit analysis of every relationship, keeping people close only as long as they served his assent and discarding them the moment they became inconvenient. The fire was dying down now. Most of the photographs consumed, and Ali stood there covered in ash and sweat despite the cool LA night, watching embers glow and fade, watching physical evidence of a friendship turn to carbon and smoke. His hands were shaking slightly. The Parkinson's starting early, though, he didn't know that yet. Didn't know that in a few years the tremor would be constant and unmistakable. Didn't know that his body was already beginning the betrayal that would define his later life. What would Marcus say if he could see Ali now, alone in a backyard burning their history? Probably something about poetic justice. About Ali finally being alone after spending his whole life choosing loneliness over loyalty. About how nobody would be there for Ali when he needed them because he'd never been there for anyone else. And the worst part was Ali couldn't entirely disagree, couldn't construct a defense that felt honest, could only acknowledge that maybe he'd built his greatness on the ruins of relationships he'd sacrificed without adequately mourning. The back door opened and Ali's wife appeared, silhouetted against kitchen light. And she stood there for a moment, just watching him before speaking. "You coming to bed?" she asked, voice neutral, not judging but not approving either, recognizing this as one of Ali's moods that was better observed than interrupted. "Soon," Ali said, not turning around, not wanting her to see his face, not ready to explain what he was doing or why it mattered. Not sure he could articulate the specific grief of burning a friendship that had already died, but whose corpse he'd been dragging around for years. She went back inside and Ali was alone again with the dying fire and the weight of choices he couldn't undo. There was one photograph left, the last one, and he held it without adding it to the flames, just studied it in the orange glow. Him and Marcus at 12 years old, the very beginning, before boxing, before ambition. Before the machinery of success had pulled them in different directions. Just two kids on a Louisville street corner, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at whoever had taken the picture. That version of them had loved each other simply, without calculation, without any awareness that friendship could be a commodity or that people could be used up and discarded. That version of them had believed they'd be friends forever because they couldn't imagine a future where they weren't. Could you burn that without burning part of yourself? Ali raised the photograph toward the fire, held it there, felt the heat on his fingers, but couldn't quite release it. Couldn't quite destroy this last piece of evidence that once, before everything got complicated, they'd been brothers in the uncomplicated way kids understand brotherhood. His hand trembled. Parkinson's or emotion, impossible to separate. And finally he lowered the photograph, tucked it into his pocket. Decided some things were worth keeping even if they hurt. He scattered the ashes from the metal drum, buried the evidence of his midnight ritual, and went inside to a house that was too big and too empty despite being full of people. To a bed where his wife pretended to be asleep, but was probably awake listening to him move through rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. Sleep didn't come. Ali lay there staring at ceiling, thinking about Marcus, about all the people he'd left behind in his climb toward greatness, about whether being the greatest was worth the cost of having nobody who remembered who you were before you became the greatest. Would history remember Muhammad Ali or just the highlights, the quotable moments, the championships stripped of context about the human wreckage required to achieve them? The interview had ended with Marcus being asked if he'd reconcile with Ali if given the chance. And Marcus had been quiet for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he'd finally said. "Part of me misses my friend. But my friend died a long time ago, was murdered by Muhammad Ali's ambition. And I don't know if the person left is worth forgiving or just another stranger who happens to look like someone I used to love." The words had haunted Ali for 6 months, had kept him up nights, had driven him to this backyard fire ritual that solved nothing and changed nothing, but at least acknowledged that something needed to be mourned. That you couldn't just keep accumulating damage without occasionally stopping to count the cost. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived, postmarked Louisville. Handwriting Ali recognized immediately. He held it for an hour before opening it, terrified and hopeful in equal measure. Not sure which outcome he feared more, reconciliation or permanent severing, bridge rebuilt or bridge burned beyond repair. Inside a single page, Marcus's handwriting less neat than it used to be. I saw the interview made it to you. Good. You needed to hear it. Needed to know that I wasn't just going to disappear quietly into your past while you pretended our friendship meant something it never did. But here's what I didn't say in the interview: I'm dying. Lung cancer, stage 4, couple months left if the doctors are right. And facing death makes you evaluate what matters, what you want to carry with you into whatever comes next. I don't forgive you. Can't. The betrayals were too deep, too foundational to who you chose to become. But I also don't want to die hating you, don't want my last thoughts to be about resentment and what ifs and roads not taken. So I'm letting it go. Not for you, for me. Because carrying this poison is killing me faster than the cancer, and I want whatever time I got left to be about more than bitterness. You don't need to respond to this. Don't need to visit or call or try to make amends. Just know that I see you. Not Muhammad Ali the greatest, but Cassius Clay from Louisville, the kid I used to know before the world got to him. And I'm choosing to remember that kid instead of mourning the man he didn't become. D better than you lived, like you told that racist in Indiana. That's all any of us can hope for. Marcus, Ali read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing different layers, different weights, different implications. Marcus was dying and had chosen grace over revenge, had decided that whatever Ali had done didn't justify Marcus spending his final months consumed by anger. What do you do with forgiveness you didn't ask for and aren't sure you deserve? Ali wanted to crumple the letter, to burn it like he'd burned the photographs, to refuse this gift that felt less like absolution and more like a final judgment on who he'd become. But he also knew Marcus was right. Dying was coming for both of them eventually, and spending whatever time remained nursing grievances was a waste of the only non-renewable resource any of them had. He wrote back, a letter that went through a dozen drafts, each one trying to find language adequate for the complexity of what he felt. Gratitude and guilt and grief and regret layered, so thick it was hard to separate individual emotions. Finally, he settled on something simple. Marcus, I'm sorry. Not for everything. Some of what you said in the interview was wrong or exaggerated or leaving out context. But for enough. For the promises I didn't keep. For the girlfriend. For treating you like a means instead of an end. For becoming the kind of person who could do those things and justify them as necessary sacrifices on the altar of greatness. You're right that I'm not the kid you knew in Louisville. But I'm also not proud of who I became in the process of leaving that kid behind. There's got to be a version where I become great without destroying the people who helped me get there, and I failed to find that version. I won't ask you to forgive me. You already said you can't, and I respect that. But I want you to know I see you too. Not as the friend who didn't make it, not as a cautionary tale about wasted potential, but as Marcus Webb, who was braver and kinder and more human than I ever managed to be. D better than you lived. I'll try to do the same. Muhammad. He mailed the letter and waited, no expectation of response, but needing to send it anyway. Needing Marcus to know that the message had been received and understood even if it couldn't fix what had been broken. 6 weeks later, a call from Marcus's sister. He'd died peacefully, surrounded by family, and in his final days had talked about Ali often. Had told stories about their childhood that made everyone laugh. Had chosen to remember the good instead of dwelling on the bad. She thought Ali would want to know. The funeral was small. Just family and a few friends from the Louisville boxing community, and Ali attended wearing dark glasses and a suit, sitting in the back where hopefully nobody would recognize him or make a scene. The eulogy focused on Marcus's work with young boxers, his patience and kindness, his belief that boxing could teach kids discipline and confidence, even if they never turned pro. He never became a champion. Marcus's sister said, but he created champions, gave kids tools they needed to survive in a world that didn't want them to succeed. That's a different kind of greatness, quieter but just as important. Was it? Was teaching kids to box really as important as being heavyweight champion of the world? The old Ali would have said no automatically, would have maintained that nothing compared to being the best, that history remembered champions, not trainers. But sitting in the back of a funeral for someone who'd once been his best friend, Ali wasn't sure anymore, wasn't certain that his definition of greatness hadn't been too narrow, too focused on individual achievement at the expense of collective impact. After the service, Ali approached the casket, looked down at Marcus's face peaceful in death, and said quietly where nobody else could hear, "I'm sorry I wasn't better. I'm sorry I chose fame over friendship. I'm sorry you had to die to make me see what I'd lost." The apology felt inadequate, too little too late. The kind of thing you say when there's no longer any possibility of response or reconciliation, when all you can do is speak into the void and hope it matters somehow. Driving back to LA, Ali thought about the photograph still in his pocket, the one he hadn't burned, two 12-year-old kids who'd believed they'd be friends forever. He pulled over at a rest stop, took out the photo, really looked at it one more time. The innocence, the certainty, the complete ignorance of how complicated friendship becomes when success enters the equation. Then, carefully, he tore the photograph in half, separated himself from Marcus, put his half back in his pocket, and buried Marcus's half under a tree at the rest stop, a small private memorial to a friendship that had died years before Marcus's body gave out. What remains when you've burned all the evidence except the memories that live where fire can't reach? Everything and nothing. The facts of the friendship, the boxing, the shared dreams, the betrayals, the interview, the letters. Those could be documented and analyzed and judged by people who'd never met either of them. But the emotional truth of what they'd meant to each other, what had been lost when ambition pulled them apart, what Marcus's death took from the world, that lived only in Ali's consciousness, inaccessible to anyone else. Years later, when Parkinson's had stolen most of Ali's ability to communicate, when speaking required enormous effort and most days he chose silence, someone asked him if he had regrets. Ali nodded slowly, laboriously, and managed 3 words: friends. Behind. The interviewer pressed for elaboration, but Ali had no more words, had exhausted his ability to explain. And the moment passed into yet another piece of Muhammad Ali mythology that people would interpret however they wanted without knowing the specific weight of those 3 words. Without understanding that he was thinking about Marcus and the photograph and the backyard fire and all the people he'd sacrificed on his way to being the greatest. Would he do it differently if given the chance, or was the sacrifice necessary? Was there no version of this story where Ali becomes Ali without leaving Marcus and others like him in the rearview mirror? The question had no answer, or too many answers, or the kind of answer that changed depending on who was asking and why, and what they needed to believe about the nature of greatness and its cost. All Ali knew was that he'd lived one version of the story, had made certain choices that led to certain outcomes, and now had to carry the weight of those choices into whatever came next. The photograph's other half stayed in his pocket through everything, through more fights and losses, through Parkinson's diagnosis and declining health, through moments of glory and moments of despair. Sometimes he'd take it out and look at it, that 12-year-old version of himself grinning next to empty space where Marcus used to be, and wonder if that kid would recognize the man he'd become, would approve of the trades he'd made, would understand why greatness had required so much sacrifice. And sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come and the Parkinson's made his body shake without permission, Ali would think he heard Marcus's voice, not angry or bitter but curious, asking the same question he'd asked in the backyard fire. Was it worth it? Everything you gave up, everyone you left behind, all the damage you did to become the greatest, was it actually worth it? Ali never answered out loud, because there was no answer that felt true. No response that captured the complexity of trading friendship for fame, love for legacy, humanity for history. He just held the torn photograph and remembered 2 kids who'd believed they'd be friends forever. Before they'd learned that forever was negotiable and friendship was conditional, and greatness was hungry in ways that consumed more than you realized until everything was already gone. What do you burn and what do you keep, and how do you live with the difference? That was the question Ali would carry into death, unanswered and unanswerable. The price of becoming the greatest etched in missing people and burned photographs, and the specific grief of knowing you chose right according to one metric and wrong according to every other one. And somewhere in Louisville, in a boxing gym where kids still learn to keep their hands up and move their feet, Marcus's legacy continued in ways Ali's never could, quieter and smaller but maybe more human, teaching children that greatness came in forms that didn't require championships or sacrifice or leaving anyone behind. Two different kinds of greatness, two different definitions of success, and Ali, standing alone at the end of his life, no longer certain which one mattered more or whether being uncertain was its own kind of answer. The fire had gone out, the ashes had scattered, the photograph was torn, and all that remained was memory and regret and the understanding that you can't become great without destroying something. The only question being whether what you destroy is worth what you build. Muhammad Ali, the greatest, had made his choice. And now, at the end, he had to live with it, or more accurately, die with it, carrying the weight of burned friendships into whatever came next. Was it worth it? Ask him in 100 years. Maybe by then the answer will be clear.